Okay. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm quite pleased to welcome Professor Kodosky to tonight's talk on the Cuban Missile Crisis. Professor Kodosky is a professor of history at the University of Westchester, just outside of Philadelphia. He serves as the faculty advisor to the Student Veterans Group. He additionally acts as the Eastern Pennsylvania Regional Coordinator for Phi Alpha Theta and accepted an invitation to serve on Phi Alpha Theta's National Council. He's also a board member at the American Helicopter Museum and Education Center in Westchester. He is actually an expert on the Cold War and on military affairs. He works together with military veterans on campus and off. And he has some interesting books. There's one book, Psychological Operations, American Style, the Joint United States Public Affairs Office, Vietnam and Beyond. Dr. Kodosky's scholarship also appears in the Encyclopedia of Military Science, the American Intelligence Journal, the Routledge History of Social Protest in Popular Music, the Journal of Popular Culture, History, Reviews of New Books, the Michigan War Studies Review, and H-War. So he's quite a versatile scholar. So I'm really looking forward to his thoughts on the Cuban Missile Crisis. Let me show this. We have another talk on Wednesday. This, I hope you can see this. This is our invitation. This is the script that you can find on American ammunition cases in the Second World War. I don't know whether they still do this, but I saw some of these military ammunition cases, and they had this script. So tonight it's To the Brink and Back: The Lasting Lessons of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Bob, go ahead.
Thank you.
You have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you, Bruno. It's a pleasure to be here. And, I must say, we just passed through Veterans Day and we mounted an exhibit on campus that we're calling The Real and the Real. It's a collection of World War II artifacts and movie memorabilia, but we hosted a 99-year-old veteran whose World War II experience began on Utah Beach, and he had many interesting stories. So anyway, so let me pull this up and share. And if I can pull this. So this is the talk To the Brink and Back from Cuba 62 to Able Archer 83. What I would like to do is to try and take a long view, sort of contextualize what happened regarding the missile crisis. I did have the opportunity to talk with the speaker that you'll be hosting on Wednesday, I guess, right, Bruno?
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
The marvelous exhibit that they've opened in Berlin. Is it in Berlin?
Well, it's in Munich. It's in the America House in Munich. Yeah.
It sounds terrific, and it sounds like he's going to focus on sort of the minute by minute of the missile crisis, and I'm taking a little bit wider of a view here. So let me begin by referencing the book that Bruno spoke of, Psychological Operations, American Style. This book deals with the Vietnam War, and when I was writing this book, I was interested in the part of the war that nobody else seemed to be writing about seriously, and that was the American effort to win hearts and minds in Vietnam. And the phrase was one that policymakers spoke a lot about. It's also something that historians talked a lot about, but there really wasn't much of an analysis of what occurred in that effort. It was part of the counterinsurgency effort that went on that the United States carried out in Vietnam. And as part of that work, many of the ones who were in Vietnam who worked for the Central Intelligence Agency, the American CIA, had during the Second World War worked for something called the Office of Strategic Services. The Office of Strategic Services was created by William Donovan, an American, who admired what the British were doing in terms of special operations, in terms of things like sabotage and propaganda and all of the rest. And so Donovan and the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, greatly impressed people who were skeptical to begin with in the military, including Dwight David Eisenhower. And that's important, of course, because Eisenhower later becomes president of the United States when the CIA is operable. Anyway, in my research with the OSS sort of had this, I don't know, kind of wild approach to things. And to some degree, the OSS functioned as an intelligence organization, but was really enamored with what some of their operatives called dirty tricks. And some of them were quite outlandish. So you see there a picture of a fox and Operation Fantasia. The OSS became convinced that there would be some effectiveness if the United States invaded Japan first to utilize bats. Much of this grew out of what I argue was very racist and kind of other kind of thinking, meaning that when the OSS planned, it planned in a way against the Japanese that it did not plan against the Germans. There was never any consideration that somehow utilizing bats, flying bats would strike fear into the heart of Germans, but they entertained this idea against the Japanese until they learned that they couldn't get bats at high altitude to Japan. They died in the plains, so they moved on to foxes. And they developed these battalions that included foxes. They traveled through the Western Hemisphere and they collected foxes from all over the place and brought them to the Smithsonian. And they worked on ways to paint these foxes so they would glow in the dark. They created these fox whistles. They had fox costumes. The whole idea was that had the United States invaded Japan, there would have been a battalion of soldiers dressed up like foxes and with these glowing, sort of this crazy idea, right? Almost cartoonish. Well, when I was working on this book, I happened to have a conversation with a gentleman in rural Pennsylvania. And at the time, the United States had just invaded Afghanistan. And the store was empty, and the gentleman looked at me and he said, "Do you know what we should do?" And I said, "What?" And the gentleman said, "We should nuke them." And I must have looked at him with some degree of displeasure and went to leave the store when he leaned over the counter and he said, "You know what we should really do?" And I said, "What?" And he said, "Pigs." He said, quote, "The towelheads are afraid of pigs, and if we sent pigs over there, they would come running out of the tunnels." And I thought, oh my God, The OSS learned about foxes and bats because people were writing the President of the United States that the Japanese were afraid of these things, and it actually went into development. Don't write the President of the United States. I don't want to turn on CNN and see pigs being released in Afghanistan. So as a consequence of this book, I've done some work with the government. I've done some consulting with the State Department and our special operations people here, and also the CIA. And I've told them that story. I share with you now an email that I received from the CIA, taking interest in the pig story and wanting to know if they would be able to use it in a briefing. And I thought, oh my God, I'm just giving them an idea. So hopefully that's not the case. I'm pointing all of this out because the CIA has this continued fascination with this kind of thing. This sort of, whether you call it sabotage or again, dirty tricks, which I'll get back to, continues to very much infect the culture. And I argue that it very much plays a role in the Cuban Missile Crisis. I do have to warn you, though, that in my work, working with the government and working with the CIA on at least one occasion, I had some opportunities to have conversations about sort of the good old days, the Cold War, with former members of the KGB. And in one of those conversations with a gentleman by the name of Oleg Kalugin, who was operating in the United States during the Cold War and is in the United States now because he had a disagreement with one Vladimir Putin, some other people were involved in the conversation. And as a consequence of that, somehow I suppose Kodosky and Kalugin sound compatible because there are at least 3 books out there. This one's called Voices from the Vietnam War, Stories from American, Asian, and Russian Veterans, that identify me as a retired Major General Robert J. Kodosky, a former KGB agent. So, of course, I have fun with this with students. My colleagues shake their head and suggest that I perhaps do something about it. But when I walk into committees on campus, I tell them I'm the most dangerous professor on campus. So anyway, that's a little bit of a backstory to all of this. There are at least 3 books out there. Now, if you Google Robert Kodosky and KGB, you'll see my picture and all of the rest. So some fun, I guess, to do. Alan Dulles, who did serve as the director of Central Intelligence in the United States at one point in the late 1960s, responded to a question about American involvement overseas by saying, perhaps we have already intervened too much in the affairs of other people. The National Security Act of 1947 is what established the CIA. And as I mentioned, the CIA grew out of the OSS. And when World War II ended, William Donovan very heavily petitioned to have the CIA created out of the remnants of the OSS and found success in that. And of course, the United States, until that point, possessed no civilian intelligence agency. We had a naval intelligence, we had army intelligence, but no civilian intelligence. And the thinking after Pearl Harbor was that such an agency would have been able to prevent that. So the CIA was created in 1947, and of course, almost immediately, American attention turned toward the Soviet Union. And the perception was that the Soviet Union was engaging the United States in a conflict where it was conducting activities sort of below board, meaning covert operations, meaning economic warfare, propaganda. And the United States didn't possess this capability. And there was worry amongst policymakers about the United States performing these kinds of activities as a liberal democratic state. The National Security Council, also created from the National Security Act of 1947, with input from former OSS people, passed NSC 10-2 in June of 1948. So the overt activities of the US government must be supplemented by covert operations, propaganda, economic warfare, subversion against hostile states, including assistance to underground resistance movements, guerrilla and refugee liberation groups. If uncovered, the United States government can plausibly disclaim any responsibility for them. So NSC 10-2 is creating this office within the CIA called the Office of Special Projects, or the Office of Policy Coordination. It remained unacknowledged officially. It was housed in the CIA, but tasked in the charter with, quote, other functions and duties from time to time. It had access to unvouchered funds. It operated independently of other CIA components under the direct authority of representatives from the CIA, state, defense, JCS, and the president, all formally denied political responsibility, leaving the discretion of activities to the office itself. Kind of confusing, but fundamentally, the United States created an organization within an organization, a secret organization within a secret organization, to carry out activities that American policymakers would be able to deny publicly. Now, when President Dwight Eisenhower took power, his Secretary of State was John Foster Dulles, and of course, Allen Dulles was John Foster Dulles' brother. And many of the old OSS guys became CIA guys and found themselves engaged in the kinds of activities running through these offices that the OSS had engaged in during the Second World War. Some of it is as loony as glow-in-the-dark foxes and bats and things like that. The Eisenhower administration believed that it wasn't fiscally responsible to maintain a large standing army and wanted to combat Soviet intentions on expansion through a two-pronged policy: mutual assured destruction, atomic weapons, the threat of credibly using them, and a very covert agenda where they believed that, you know, there was less possibility for the United States to get dragged into something like a Korean War again. So throughout, beginning in the 1940s and then through the 1950s, the CIA and sort of the components within the CIA were involved in making a number of elections go the way the United States wanted them to go in places like Italy and the Philippines and Chile, and of course in Vietnam. And the attitude was very simplistic. I mean, what we were looking for were people who said they opposed communism and would bring some kind of stability. And I think you're familiar enough with some of these leaders to know that stability meant heavy-handed rule in many cases, but in opposition to communism. Beginning in the 1950s, the CIA began to sort of go beyond fixing elections. And despite in two cases, things looking like they would not go well until the very last minute, they appeared to have terrific success. And I'm talking about in 1953, when the CIA worked with MI6 and the British to deal with the threat to British oil interests in Iran, and through Operation Ajax, that was run by Kermit Roosevelt, a relation of Theodore Roosevelt. And Kermit, of course, also former OSS, now CIA, deposed the Iranian Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh, largely because he was perceived as being, or identified as being, a communist. Similar situation, Operation PD Success in 1954, where at the behest of United Fruit Company, which John Foster Dulles had served on the board prior to moving into government, the CIA deposed Guatemalan President Jacob Arbenz. And again, a similar kind of allegation that an effort to nationalize Guatemalan fruit interests was communist. And so in the 1950s, there's this tendency of the United States to use the CIA and to use it in a way that was conflating communism with nationalism in a very, very simplistic sort of us versus them worldview. So by the time you get to the end of the 1950s and the beginning of the 1960s, with the ascent of Fidel Castro in Cuba, Operation Zapata seems to make a lot of sense. The CIA was having, by all accounts, by administration accounts, terrific success in toppling regimes that were threatening American economic interests. Certainly Castro was doing that in Cuba. And an operation that began under Eisenhower was authorized under Kennedy, and I'm talking about the Bay of Pigs invasion, which, without getting into too much detail here, I mean, the CIA worked with Cuban exiles, and the plan was, with American assets and support that were sort of flying under other flags, to bring down the Castro regime. It was a disaster. And of course, Kennedy became enraged about the CIA over this, but he had bigger problems because as a young president, he was perceived as being not experienced, naive, weak. And shortly after the Bay of Pigs invasion, in a meeting that was in motion to happen, he met with Khrushchev, Nikita Khrushchev, in Vienna on June 4th, 1961. And Khrushchev came out of that meeting very much under the impression that Kennedy was naive, that Kennedy had been embarrassed in Cuba, that Kennedy was not a particularly strong president in terms of foreign policy. And of course, by the middle of August 1961, the Berlin Wall began construction. And of course, these events in sequence and Kennedy's own feelings of inferiority lead him to really double down on Castro. Now, again, this had started in March of 1960. President Dwight Eisenhower had signed off on a CIA paper titled A Program of Covert Action Against the Castro Regime. In November of 1961, President Kennedy authorized something called Operation Mongoose. And this is just a page from a memo from a meeting. And you see here, it took place in October of 1962. I mean, Mongoose is operating through and then even beyond the missile crisis. I mean, there was this obsession of regime change in Cuba that included all kinds of crazy schemes. I mean, trying to poison Castro in any number of ways, trying to get waiters near him, all kinds of things. Andrew Basovich, who's a retired lieutenant colonel, he served in Vietnam. He's a scholar now, has a PhD, has written a number of books, including a couple of terrific ones about the Middle East and about American militarism. He says in Washington Rules, America's Path to Permanent War, which published in 2010, the actions of the United States toward Cuba during the early 1960s bear comparison with Iranian and Syrian support for proxies engaging in terrorist activities against Israel. I don't think he's too far off the mark there. As a consequence of all of this activity, of course, in some ways, Khrushchev is being pushed by United States policies more wholly into the Soviet camp. And of course, what that results in are missiles. And the crisis, which runs from October 16th to October 29th, 1962, at least in part, is a reaction to American provocation stemming from what scholars refer to as a confirmation bias in the intelligence community, fundamentally setting out to find evidence that supports whatever the idea is. And in this particular case, there was such an obsession with trying to topple the Castro regime that at least one intelligence scholar, I think with some justification, says that this was probably the biggest intelligence failure in American history. The missiles were delivered to Cuba and no one in the United States knew about it. Now, of course, you find out about it through the aerial photography, but what happens in the 1950s, this transformation of the CIA from an intelligence gathering and processing agency to one more and more engaged in covert operations, blurs its focus and detracts from that intelligence mission in a way that the CIA starts to miss things. And it happens because of that perceived success in Iran and Guatemala, and because collecting intelligence is largely a not rewarding task. Thinking about it, good intelligence agencies prevent things from happening. And that's a difficult case to make to people who fund budgets in the government and through oversight committees and all of the rest. It's much more sexy, per se, to topple governments, to fix elections. I mean, it's a consequence of really weaponizing the intelligence system, creating metrics almost similar to what a military would use. In terms of the crisis itself in Cuba, I would highly recommend this book. It's relatively new. It came out a couple of years ago, and Plaki, who is a Hungarian historian, had access to Eastern archives and also does something that a lot of histories of the Cuban Missile Crisis don't do. He brings the Cubans into the story, which is shockingly uncommon. He notes a couple of things in his book that I just want to point out because they continue to be important. He says the intent of his book is to consider the myriad situations where they, meaning Kennedy and Khrushchev, got things wrong. And I think he makes a pretty persuasive case that almost at every turn of events, Kennedy and Khrushchev were not making particularly good decisions. But the crisis did not develop into a shooting war, he writes, because Kennedy and Khrushchev both feared nuclear weapons and dreaded their use. They were terrified of nuclear weapons. And at the end of the day, basically just found a way through it, of course, which involved the American pledge to remove the missiles from Turkey and Italy privately. But this fear factor at the top is what Plaki argues. And he also talks about instincts on the ground. I mean, you may or may not be aware, but the United States Navy was harassing and tracking a Soviet submarine. And it's kind of interesting because on most Soviet submarines at the time, to utilize nuclear weapons, it required the yes vote of 2 officers. On this particular submarine that was being harassed by the United States Navy, depth charges and flares and things like that, and the submarine was out of contact with Moscow, thought that there was a shooting war going on. And there was a discussion on the submarine between Captain Valentin Savitsky, the political officer, Ivan Maslenikov, and they voted to retaliate with a nuclear torpedo. Had that been any other submarine, they would have retaliated with a nuclear torpedo. It just happened that the detachment commander, a gentleman by the name of Vasily Arkhipov, was also on that submarine. And because he was, they needed all 3 to say yes. And he said no. And the submarine surfaced, and there was some communication between the United States and that submarine, and it ended up getting turned around. So very, very close to the whole thing spiraling out of control because of this incident on the seas. Coming out of the Cuban Missile Crisis, obviously communication, and the sort of so-called Moscow to Washington hotline, or just visually often projected as sort of this red telephone. It wasn't a telephone, it was a teletype machine. There it is. On August 30th, 1963, the United States sent the test phrase, "Quick brown fox jumped over the lazy dog's back 1 through 0, which prompted Russian translators on the other side to say, what does it mean when your people say the quick brown fox jumped over the lazy dog? That phrase and those numbers, the reason they did that is because it includes all the characters on the keyboard. In other words, to make sure everything worked. And it was by key rather than voice, because the idea was that there would be less chance of miscommunication by putting things in writing. So this is something that comes out of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Out of the whole Cuban affair, there is this scrutiny of American intelligence. And Admiral Sidney Sowers, who is there, who served as the first director of Central Intelligence in 1946, and then from 1947 to 1950, wrote to Harry Truman in 1963 saying, with so much emphasis on operations, it would not surprise me to find that the matter of collecting and processing intelligence has suffered. Truman in 1963 sort of echoes this in an interview that he gave to the North American Newspaper Alliance, saying, for some time, I have been disturbed by the way the CIA has been diverted from its original assignment. It's become an operational arm, at times a policy-making arm of government. I never had any thought when I set it up that it would be injected into peacetime cloak and dagger operations. What happens through this, I think, is that the agency, one of the things that intelligence, good intelligence, and I would argue especially human intelligence, which the United States historically has not done very well, we tend to rely on technology, spy satellites and things like that. But having people on the ground enables policymakers something called strategic empathy, meaning the ability to understand a situation from an adversary's perspective. Doesn't necessarily mean agreeing or sympathizing with an adversary, but it does mean understanding what their point of view is, rather than simplifying it. There's only so much you can learn from a photograph, no matter how good the photograph is. There's a different kind of quality that one can get from a human asset. And there are a lot of reasons the United States does not do well in utilizing human assets and relies on technology. But the CIA, as in part a consequence of what happened in Cuba, comes under an immense amount of scrutiny in the 1970s. I mean, there were a number of committees, the Church Committee, the Pike Committee, both the Church and the Senate and the Pike Committee, House of Representatives, and then the Vice President, Nelson Rockefeller, also had a commission that investigated the CIA. And the CIA was really reined in. I mean, it was pulled back. You know, the reference to the CIA's assassination programs, its family jewels. I mean, a lot of this started to become public for the first time. And there were a lot of people questioning the CIA's use. And remember, this is post-Vietnam, post-Watergate, and also in a period of détente. This era of relaxed Cold War tension, you see Brezhnev and Nixon there during Brezhnev's June 1973 visit to Washington, D.C., where, you know, strategic arms limitation talks, part of the consequence of Cuba, a variety of other conversations, you know, trying to bring together the United States and the Soviet Union. The period of détente, though, doesn't last a terribly long time. By the time you get to the end of the 1970s, here we have the first chief directorate chief saying US imperialism is again becoming aggressive and is striving to change the strategic balance. We must not overlook the possibility of a US missile attack on our country, and that's in 1980. And there was a lot of other similar kinds of comments coming out of the Soviet Union during this time period. Party Secretary Mikhail Suslov, speaking to the Polish Party Conference in February of 1980, talked about a profound interconnection to recent inspired actions aimed at a new arms race. Days later, Defense Minister Dmitry Ustinov denounced interconnected elements of an aggressive US policy. And relatively moderate, Premier Alexei Kosygin charged that the United States policies that the Soviets were now seeing resulted from reactionary forces and constituted a fully defined political policy calculated to undermine détente and provoke conflict situations. So what happened? Why the turn of events? Well, some of it had to do with the improved relations between the United States and the People's Republic of China. There you see famously Deng Xiaoping with a 10-gallon hat on at a rodeo in Texas. There was this perception in the Soviet Union that the United States was forming an anti-Soviet alliance with China that, first of all, resulted in Chinese going to war with Vietnam over Cambodia, and also an increased Sino-American military and diplomatic cooperation regarding the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. The Soviets were profoundly shocked at America's reaction to Afghanistan. They never calculated that the United States would oppose it. They saw it as something that the United States would see as within the Soviet Union's legitimate security interests, a regional concern, not an affair of the Soviet Union. Soviets also condemned the presidential administration of Jimmy Carter for, quote, training and sending of armed terrorist groups in Afghanistan. Of course, the CIA was involved with this. You see there on the left, his national security advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, who really immediately he identifies Afghanistan. He calls it the Soviet Vietnam and is very interested in providing American support. And so the CIA starts to return to this role under the Carter administration. But the Soviets are also upset about a couple of other things. The United States didn't ratify the Second SALT Treaty, started to show a lot of interest in new generations of intercontinental ballistic missiles, submarine launched ballistic missiles, intercontinental bombers, the stealth. And very importantly, in July of 1980, Jimmy Carter signed a new presidential directive, number 59, a new nuclear strategy that sought to enhance, quote, the readiness of US strategic nuclear forces to deliver a sudden preemptive strike against the Soviet Union. Carter, the directive didn't say that. The Soviets thought it did. But what the directive did do was give the American president more flexibility in utilizing nuclear weapons. It was reliant on new technology that aimed to make decision-making more flexible. And the Soviets were very much afraid that this could lead to a potential first strike. And of course, in 1980, the United States elects Ronald Wilson Reagan. And Reagan very much was an idealist. He rejected the notion of détente for a return to 1950s rollback, and in a lot of ways embraced the policies of the Dulles brothers and Eisenhower. William Casey, who was appointed director of Central Intelligence, the CIA all of a sudden is back in business. Covert operations in all kinds of places, but probably most notably in Poland, South Africa, Angola, Nicaragua, El Salvador, Haiti, and Afghanistan. And of course, publicly, Reagan was fond of referencing the Soviet Union as an evil empire. By 1983, the Soviet press concluded that Reagan, quote, can think only in terms of confrontation and bellicose lunatic anti-communism. Andropov told Pravda about SDIs. Reagan had this idea of developing what the press dubs Star Wars, this sort of missile defense system that would prohibit a first strike from the Soviets. Well, the Soviet reaction said what seems to be defensive measures is in fact an intention of acquiring a nuclear first strike capability. And the Soviets were really concerned about this. They really, truly believed that the United States was looking to acquire a first strike capability. And they began thinking about this in the middle of the 1970s. They developed a computer model, VRIAN, which in Russian is an acronym for nuclear missile attack. They put it online in 1979 to identify inherently unstable political situations in which a deterioration of Soviet power might tempt a US first strike. The thing was a database of 40,000 weighted elements, which software processed and continually reevaluated based on military, political, and economic factors that the Soviets saw as decisive during the Second World War. A generation of Soviets felt that what occurred during the Second World War could never happen again, that the Soviets were caught off guard and they were determined not to let it happen and believed that the United States was looking to reach a point where it so outweighed the Soviet Union in terms of power, military, economic, political, that it would launch a first strike. This program assigned the United States a fixed value of 100. And from the Soviet point of view, Soviet safety depended on maintaining a value against it of at least 60. Falling below 40 indicated the inability to maintain Soviet security. And from the Soviet point of view, if they fell below 40, that set in motion the need for the Soviets to launch a first strike. In May of 1981, acting as KGB chief, Yuri Andropov elevated VRIAN's importance, making the foremost mission of both the KGB and the GRU, military intelligence, the collection of intelligence that suggested American intentions for nuclear attack. Remember, I talked about confirmation bias in the Americans basically seeing in Castro what they wanted to see. Now you have a Soviet Union using Ryan, issuing these orders basically to go out and demonstrate that the Americans are doing what they're suggesting they're doing. Andropov also visited Prague and secured the Czech intelligence service to prioritize Ryan also. KGB directive in February of 1983, permanent operational assignment to uncover NATO preparations for a nuclear attack on the Soviet Union. This is about the time, by the end of the year, there would be Pershing II missiles deployed to West Germany, which were aimed to counter Soviet SS-20 missiles. The Soviets wrongly believed that the Pershing IIs would be able to hit Moscow. Soviets saw this as one of the states of immediate preparation by the adversary for Ryan. Following the shooting down of the Korean airliner on September 1st, 1983, the Reagan administration's anti-Soviet rhetoric increased markedly. The Soviets, of course, refused to take responsibility for the death of the 269 passengers, but the Reagan administration had been unaware that the military had been undertaking highly secret probes of Soviet air and maritime borders prior to the shootdown. And the Soviets thought genuinely that this is one of these flights. Further, American intelligence officials tasked with assessing Soviet behavior remained unaware of them. They saw the shooting as Soviet aggression. So someone like Robert Gates, who served as the director of Central Intelligence for 1986 and 87, and then from 91 to 93, said, in its reaction to the shoot down, the administration's rhetoric outran the facts that were known to it. So you have an American administration reacting to the Soviet Union without really understanding the complexity of what just transpired. Other events that take place in the fall of 1983 include Operation Urgent Fury, which was the United States military invasion of Grenada, basically to restore stability there. And Andropov became very sick in October. Now, by November of 1983, see the quote there from Romanov, the international situation at present is white hot, thoroughly white hot. The map there shows some of those missions that I was talking about that involved, on the other side, the Korean airliner being shot down. Here, American and NATO efforts between 1981 and 1983 to test Soviet radar vulnerability. So you had the American Air Force and the United States Navy trying to get as close to installation as they possibly could, and then turning around abruptly without having any idea or thinking about the messages that they were sending the Soviet Union. So on November the 7th, 1983, just as Soviet intelligence services sought urgently to detect the early signs of a nuclear attack, NATO began to simulate one. Able Archer was an exercise that involved numerous NATO allies, simulated NATO's command, control, and communications procedures during a nuclear war. This meant all the alert phases. The exercise went from DEFCON 5 to 1 and involved leaders such as Helmut Kohl and Margaret Thatcher. Reagan and his team were supposed to participate, but decided that they weren't going to a couple of weeks, and so they stayed out of it. The Soviet Union, believing its only chance of surviving a NATO strike was to preempt it, readied its nuclear arsenal. Nuclear-capable aircraft in Poland and East Germany were placed on high alert status with readying of nuclear forces. Soviet commanders ordered nuclear warheads to be placed on 4th Air Army bombers, and for a group of Soviet forces in Germany, fighter bombers to place on a 30-minute alert. Oleg Gordievsky, who is pictured there, an asset of MI6 in England, the KGB resident in London, received a cable from KGB headquarters notifying it that Operation Ryan had acquired a special degree of urgency and particularly grave importance. It directed a continual watch in order to provide warning very early stage of any preparation by the adversary for a nuclear missile attack on the Soviet Union. On November 8th or 9th, he couldn't remember afterwards, he reported an urgent telegram from Moscow Center requesting more information about a pending American first strike. Now, to reemphasize, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, both sides were acutely aware of what was going on. In this case, the United States is provoking the Soviet Union to the brink of a nuclear war and really has no idea that the Soviets are perceiving things the way they are. The decision not to elevate the alert of Western military assets in response was made by Lieutenant General Leonard Perutz while serving as Assistant Chief of Staff for Intelligence, U.S. Air Forces Europe. The after report of his actions describes his decision as fortuitous, if ill-informed, and states, he and his officers acted correctly out of instinct, not informed guidance, for in the years leading up to Able Archer, they had received no guidance as to the possible significance of apparent changes in Soviet military and political thinking. The United States, the intelligence apparatus, had remained completely in the dark, in part because our intelligence activities, generally speaking, but probably especially against the Soviet Union, once again in the 1980s had very quickly turned toward that model of emphasizing covert activities. So they're still working. I mean, some of the stuff that I looked at for this has only been declassified recently, and they're continuing to sort of try and understand exactly how close we came, but there is a consensus that it was pretty close, and Perutz's decision not to respond to the Soviets enabled ultimately by the end of the exercise for the Soviets to begin to wind things down, but the United States remained completely unaware through the whole thing. So, kind of in conclusion, I guess, is path back from the brink, the tone from the top, both in Cuba and around Able Archer, Plucky mentions Kennedy and Khrushchev's fear as being important. Well, just as important in the 1980s was Andropov and Reagan's distrust of one another. And Able Archer, when things start to become evident to the administration, terrifies Reagan. And he begins to reach out in ways that he hadn't before to the Soviet Union, and ultimately finds a Mikhail Gorbachev who is willing to talk. I mentioned the importance of human intelligence. I mean, it enables that strategic empathy. I mean, the only reason that we learned of the Soviet perceptions being real during Operation Able Archer was because MI6 had Gordievsky on the inside, basically shaking the tree, saying, you've got to get word to the Americans, they don't understand what they're doing. The Soviets are taking all of this very seriously. The need to assess the ramifications of dirty tricks, not only in terms of blowback in places like Iran, in other words, placing a Shah or someone else, or No Dien Diem or someone else, the ramifications of that later, no matter how attractive it looks in the short term, what are the ramifications for conducting those kinds of operations regarding detracting from intelligence capabilities? We still see that sort of thing going on. I mean, most recently, the controversy regarding weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. And all of it feeds into the cruciality of checking systematically against confirmation bias. You see it very clearly in the Cuban Missile Crisis, and you also see it during Able Archer. Nations looking for evidence to support the beliefs they have about other nations or their adversaries, rather than going into it with an open mind and critical thinking and really scrutinizing the intelligence product. So there you have it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, that was quite a tour de force through American secret operations and fears and expectations, and on the same on the other side. You know, it's quite fascinating. Would you see then the Cuban Missile Crisis as a major experience for the Americans, especially for their secret operations for the CIA and similar things?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the Cuban Missile Crisis, it's not an element that we necessarily think about, but it is very accurate to say the United States completely missed those missiles being moved. Mm-hmm. All of a sudden the missiles are there and, very quickly operational, more operational than what we, even understood at the time. And for a lot of reasons, the United States has, from the Cold War until now, been more reliant on technology than anything else to collect intelligence. And some of that has to do with, the United States historically has not been particularly good with other languages, other cultures, has not been especially cosmopolitan in its worldview, and is, there's literature on sort of the technocrat part of the American culture. And so why take all of the time and invest everything in getting agents in these situations or these assets that require all of this training when you can just put a satellite up there and take pictures, right? Or use electronic surveillance. But what that misses is, the Cuban Missile Crisis results in part because of what Fidel Castro sees as provocations by the United States. And, we missed that. And much of it had to do with that very simplistic worldview. You're either with us or against us. And, we've heard that very recently from American policymakers also, this simplistic sort of idea about the way the world works. And good intelligence should ward against that. It should provide opportunities for dialogue as opposed to shutting them down by, running covert operations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, the Americans should have read the countless British novels, the countless British spy novels, with people on the ground, so to speak. Yeah.
Well, certainly John F. Kennedy was quite a fan of James Bond and was on at least one occasion, although it's hard to tell if it's legend or reality. Ian Fleming, he had drinks with Kennedy, I think, and they talked various kinds of operations and possibilities and things like that. Mm-hmm. But there was that fascination, and I think it more broadly, kind of feeds into, a teacher of mine when I was working on my PhD, a military historian by the name of Russell Weigley, wrote a book called The American Way of War. And, Weigley argued that the United States tends to approach military affairs in sort of trying to shoehorn everything into a World War II box. In other words, the United States, historically, from a military point of view, has really operated in a way that's been strategically bankrupt. And he argues that because of its resources, its size, its industrial capacity, when there is sort of a clear bad guy, right? And you can sort of put it into terms where there's a dictator to topple, there's a city to destroy. The United States has the resources to sort of pile on, so to speak, annihilate the dictator, take over the capital. And we like to think of all wars on that model. But historically, of course, the United States has found itself in places like Vietnam and the Middle East. And we keep trying to use that same World War II model without understanding the complexity that exists in these other situations, because we're so enamored nationally, both public, but also our policymakers, with what we imagine the United States did during the Second World War. And the OSS is part of that, Bruno.
Yeah, there is a question in the chat. I have to. I'm going to read it, and I have to take my glasses off for that. Hello, together once again. So interesting. The famous movie 13 Days, is the script close to the truth, with all the negotiations in the background with diplomats of both sides? Question marks.
My understanding, and I saw that film, and my understanding is that it most closely coincides with Robert Kennedy's memoir. And Robert Kennedy's memoir, I would recommend reading Clokey's book, because he really scrutinizes it. And he contests the idea that what happened was the product of wise negotiating, that it more was just this realization that we can't let this happen. Because much of what he writes in the book, and it's interesting because he had access to KGB archives, and he also again uses Cuban sources, and much of what happened in the history was a continual series of misunderstandings where, it was, I don't want to say it was luck, it was fear, that it wasn't, necessarily wise negotiations.
For the German audience, there is a marvelous documentary by Peter von Zahn. Some of you might remember Die Reporter der Windrose. You can find this film on YouTube. Peter von Zahn on the Cuban, die Kubakrise, with German actors playing the American players. It's very interesting, beautifully done. Peter von Zahn was one of the foremost German reporters. And but what did the Cubans actually want? Was say placing missiles on the island of Cuba? Was that in their eyes to defend Cuba against a potential strike, or yes, was it an opportunity for a strike against America?
Well, my understanding from the Cuban perspective, it was very defensive minded. This idea that if they had these missiles, then the United States would back off. Because that effort, sometimes I think we think that the effort to unseat Castro culminated with the Bay of Pigs. Actually, it didn't. I mean, after the Bay of Pigs, and again, within the context of the wall going up in Berlin, Kennedy not only personally and politically felt vulnerable, but there was this idea of standing tough against communism. You know, we need to let the people of Berlin know. So he doubled down in Vietnam at the same time too. You know, these events, sometimes we look at just in isolation, but in real time, they were all connected. And Castro very much knew what was going on. And, you know, it was not just Castro, but there were also allies in Latin American nations. I mean, American policy through Central America, Latin America through the 20th century had been very much driven by the interests of United Fruit. And now there was an ally that was capable of providing aid, you know, from Cuba's perspective, the Soviet Union, that would enable Cuba to credibly tell the United States to back off.
Mm-hmm. And for Russia, it probably was a possibility or an opportunity, perhaps for a first strike.
Well, I think more, Bruno. I think more. Remember, the United States had missiles in Turkey. And so, you know, yeah, from the Soviet perspective, it was more about mitigating the chance that the Americans would launch a first strike. Because, you know, as the technology existed at the time, the United States was at a clear advantage. One thing that, you know, is emerging in the literature about détente, the Soviets were perfectly fine with sort of a strategic balance. What caused them worry was they were always paranoid, suspicious that the United States was trying to get one leg up. And on the American side, our policymakers never understood that because, you know, going through Ronald Reagan's mind or Kennedy's mind was, well, of course, we're never going to launch a first strike. That's not what, you know, the United States is going to do. But what they didn't realize was the Soviet Union wasn't convinced of that. You know, the Soviet Union, you know, they saw things differently.
Yeah. And on another note, it strikes me as quite interesting to see that the USA created the CIA and covert operations, operation organizations, and all that only very late. I mean, yes. They appeared on the global scene, say, with the Spanish-American War, and then naturally with the First World War, but there was no Secret Service at the time, and other Europeans were really into that.
Herbert Hoover very famously said after the First World War, during World War I, the United States did briefly create a military intelligence operation, G2, and it was a mix of civilian and military under a guy. They turned him into a captain. His name was Hebor Blankenhorn. And when it ended, there was an argument from officials that it was time for the United States to have such an agency. But the United States government, in part because following World War I became very fiscally conservative and isolationist, but also there's this notion that ran through American history that Herbert Hoover gave words to. He said, "Gentlemen do not read other gentlemen's mail." And so this notion of American fair play, and for Donovan to create the OSS during World War II, he really had to go at Roosevelt. His argument to Roosevelt is that what Americans don't understand is that what the Nazis are doing, they have stolen the ball and killed the umpire. You need to forget about fair play. We need to play a different game here. And that World War II experience became one that, you know, was enamoring for policymakers, and one that impressed people like Dwight Eisenhower. Were very skeptical of the OSS because, you know, they weren't wearing uniforms. They were sort of running around behind the lines, doing whatever they wanted. They were perceived as not being good soldiers because there's this element of sort of in the United States of sort of gentleman's rules. In the middle of the 19th century, the United States, in the midst of the Civil War, created something called the Lieber Code, General Orders 100, which really is sort of this way to sort of make war a science, one that plays almost like chess or something, right? And so now you have this renegade operation, these OSS guys running around, and even women involved. And the military guys were, you know, they didn't like it. But the OSS was effective during the Second World War, and particularly effective in France. And that impressed Eisenhower. And so when Eisenhower became president and the CIA was there, and you have all these old OSS guys that have gone into the CIA, he uses them like it's World War II all over again.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah. Yeah, well, cheating at chess is very fashionable right now. Yeah.
You know what, Bruno, even the CIA, you know, when the comments about movies, the CIA, even the full organization was kept so secret that the CIA didn't appear in a Hollywood film until North by Northwest with Cary Grant.
Yeah.
And it only there's just this sort of there's a reference at the end where Cary Grant says something like, you must be with one of those new alphabet agencies, right? And he runs through a bunch of them, and one of this, because there was sort of this order that the CIA remain out of popular culture. You know, there was this cooperation between Washington and Hollywood not to glamorize the CIA. I mean, they really, really wanted it, because they were still not really sure what the American reaction would be to using, you know, an agency the way that they were using it.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. The book's already, I'm sure the book's already has already been written, mythologizing the CIA or mythologizing the secret services. Yeah.
Oh, sure. Right.
I'm sure. Yeah. Yeah. Anyway, is there a question from the audience, perhaps? Anything? Well, if not, I'd like to thank you very much for these insights.
Thank you, Bruno, and thank those of you that came. Yeah, it's always my pleasure, and I hope it was useful.
Yeah. There's 3 people. Yeah. Yeah, unfortunately, it could have. Your talk deserves more people, but I think people are getting tired of all those Zoom meetings. You know.
I'm sure. But, right? Yeah.
To the audience, thank you for coming. Thank you for being interested in the topic. There's another talk coming up on Wednesday evening, so don't hesitate to tune in. Stay tuned, so to speak. Thank you, Bob, for doing this.
My pleasure.
For giving us this broad overview of the Cold War implications and of these of the fears and expectations of both sides. You know, thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you, Bruno, and thank you everyone else, and happy holidays.
Yeah, happy holidays. Thank you. Yeah. Okay. Bye bye.